Welcome, everyone, to the PFF Fantasy Podcast. I'm your host, Jon Macri, and we have a big one today as the legal tampering period opened up on Monday at noon Eastern Time. And man, did the news explode from that point on, and it hasn't really stopped. So I know that I haven't been able to keep up with everything on my own. So joining me to help break it all down and what these moves mean for fantasy purposes, we got the brilliant minds, brilliant fantasy minds, brilliant minds in general, of Nathan Jahnke and Kate Magdziuk here to help us go through it all. Gang, how are we feeling after the absolute flurry of news that has come in since yesterday?
I'm feeling stimulated.
Yeah.
My head is spinning. So first of all, I want to say that this is probably the most entertaining and fun free agency periods for fantasy football that I can ever remember. I'm fascinated by the lack of any movement on wide receivers. We just got a little bit of news here before the show, but like it has been all running backs all the time. And I'm going to be honest, considering the market that we just saw play out just a year ago, I'm shocked. Like what a time to be alive.
Yeah, this was a huge one, especially for running backs. Like you said, like we kind of knew that there were going to be some bigger changes for the running back situation, but I mean it's been fast and furious here. Like just new landing spots all over the place. We got trades, we got releases, we got all kinds of stuff happening here. Nate, how about you? Were you expecting this big of I guess a landscape shift for the running back position specifically?
I wasn't expecting it as quickly as it happened, with it all happening basically on Monday and then Tuesday morning, especially after last year with like Leonard Fournette, Ezekiel Elliott, Kareem Hunt, who had to wait all offseason to find a team. And the other will be a couple of those running backs, but I think it speaks a lot to the draft class as well. Of there's not the clear top guy like there was this last year, and we might not see one in the first round. I don't even know for sure if we'll see one in the second round. Like we look at most teams right now and they look fairly set at running back outside of two or three teams.
Yeah, that's really all there is, right? Like you're looking now, like there's just a couple teams left that I think desperately need like a starting running back, and there's still some running backs available in free agency. So I'm sure like while we're recording, might get like 3 more signings or something like that. But yeah, the draft will be interesting because, like you said, we've been kind of, we hinted at the draft a little bit last episode, but we haven't gone into it fully here. But the running back position specifically is going to be interesting to see how it shakes out. Might be more for long-term value than anything, but I think for 2024, like these teams are already looking kind of set at the running back position for who we should be looking at for fantasy. So we're going to get into it all. We're going to cover all the positions. But I mean, obviously, we've already been given the main focus to the running backs. That's what it's going to be here this episode. But we'll give some love to some of the wide receivers that were signed and the tight ends. And of course, the quarterbacks as well. There was a big one there with Kirk Cousins as well. So we're going to start it off with the running backs. I do want to give a quick shout out to our PFF mock draft simulator as well. I know all the hype right now is around free agency, but the NFL draft is right around the corner as well, and things are going to kick up even crazier once that happens. So if you haven't already, check out the PFF mock draft simulator. You can take control of every team. You can draft for your favorite team, however you want to do it. And yeah, kill some time before the NFL draft. Free agencies change some things. So maybe you want to do a new mock draft. I'm sure we'll have new mock drafts up on pff.com as well. And if you use the promo code 30MDS right now on pff.com, you get a 30% off annual subscriptions, which is going to include all of our NFL draft content, all of the free agency content that we've been putting out as well. There's going to be a ton. So make sure you take advantage of that promo code and the mock draft simulator here at PFF with code 30MDS. All right, let's get into it. And we got to start with Saquon Barkley signing with the Philadelphia Eagles. He's dead to Tiki Barber, but he's not dead to us for fantasy purposes because this has been, I think, one of the better landing spots. We talked about this, Kate, in the ideal fantasy running back landing spots. We like the idea of the Philadelphia Eagles. We had some other ones in mind. I think, Saquon Barkley would have fit in a number of places, but how are we feeling about Saquon Barkley going to the Philadelphia Eagles as your initial thoughts?
I'm liking it. Obviously, there's going to be, I think, a lot of scoring potential here for Saquon Barkley. I think, generally speaking, for a guy who has struggled on efficiency on an every down basis, of course, he has these plays where he pops off, but largely speaking, I don't think the environment in New York has been very conducive to efficiency on an every down basis. So I think this is going to be a huge upgrade here for Saquon Barkley. For as much credence as we want to give Tush Push, last year we actually saw DeAndre Swift, utilized often enough. I think inside the 5, inside the red zone, so not overly concerned there. My biggest question is how much usage we really project for Saquon Barkley as a receiver. And that's the only thing that has me being just a little bit more maybe tepid about this pairing than I would have thought at face value.
Yeah, that's fair. And Nate, how about you? Like Saquon Barkley, obviously, we know that he's definitely capable of handling the rushing load and the receiving load. We've seen it over the past couple of seasons, right? When he's healthy, he's had at least 250 carries. He's had 50 targets. There's more touches, I think, that are going to be spread around in this Eagles offense because they just have better receiving weapons than the Giants. I don't think that's much of a question there. So what are you looking at as far as what to expect from Saquon Barkley as far as his overall workload, including the receiving down work in Philadelphia?
Yeah, the more I researched it, the more I started to like it. On paper, the most obvious contrast is the offensive line, going from one of the worst offensive lines in New York to one of the best in Philadelphia. The Giants running backs were tackled on the backfield at one of the highest rates last year, where the Eagles were one of the lowest rates. And that's a trait that has more to do with the offensive line than the running backs. So I think that will really help Barkley improve his efficiency because he won't be getting tackled on the backfield so often. And he will have that room to make plays like he was earlier in his career in New York. So I think that was huge for him. I think in terms of receiving potential, comparing how many targets and receptions running backs had in both backfields last year, it was more similar than I thought it was. So I don't think his receiving production will get hurt all that much. The big thing was the tush push. And yeah, from the 5-yard line, Swift had plenty of runs. But if you look specifically at the 1 or 2-yard line, it was almost all Jalen Hurts. So that's a little bit concerning. But also the Giants last year, they weren't having runs from the 1 or 2-yard line all that often. So just comparing his production last year to what it can be this year, I don't think it'll hurt him in touchdowns too much. And with Jason Kelsey retired, they might not be doing the tush push as much because of how good he was at blocking on those plays. So if the Eagles offense isn't as good as at the tush push, then that could lead to more Barkley running at the goal line.
Yeah, I'd expect him to still be heavily involved there, and yeah, the touchdown totals, I'm not overly concerned about them. I mean, there's definitely, like you said, the Jalen Hurts, he's going to get his touchdowns, right? He's got, I think, even more so than what Daniel Jones offered. But yeah, I still feel pretty good. Like this is a spot where I think, at least for me, like initial, like kind of gut feeling as far as where I'd be looking at him. He's still a RB1 candidate for me in Philadelphia, that top 12 range, potentially higher. I don't know if you guys feel any differently about that.
I think from a volume standpoint, that seems really reasonable. From an upside standpoint, I still have those sort of hesitations because obviously we're looking at Saquon Barkley, who like this free agent market was super active with running backs, but he is aging. He is up there in terms of total touches among active running backs. So like always keeping that in the back of your mind. But I think largely speaking, this move should be like, even if you took away some of his volume as he starts to age, I think it should be conducive enough to some efficiency that we're looking at an RB1 pretty much out of the gate, pretty safe.
I like it. Anything else on Mr. Saquon Barkley here before we move on to some of the other running backs?
No.
All right, let's go to another one here. Tony Pollard goes from the Dallas Cowboys to the Tennessee Titans. We've talked a lot about Tony Pollard being a disappointment this past season. We talked about it in the offseason here. You know, it was his first year leading the backfield with Ezekiel Elliott out. he was also coming off that broken leg, right? And I think there was a slower start. I mean, you look at the numbers, and there definitely was a slower start in those first 10 weeks of the season compared to what he did from weeks 11 on. So I feel like Tony Pollard is kind of one of those players that is primed for like a really nice bounce back. Now, Tennessee is going to be an interesting offense. It's not going to be nearly as good as what the Dallas Cowboys were. So, Nate, I'll start with you for this one. What are your expectations for, I guess, Tony Pollard in Tennessee now?
I gotta say, my biggest fantasy takeaway from Tony Pollard actually had nothing to do with Tony Pollard. I think he's going to be a fine running back. I think he's going to be probably exactly what we probably wanted, or maybe not exactly what we wanted, but something closer to what we wanted last season coming out. Like I think that was where our sort of expectations were very high. But you mentioned the splits in like the first half of the season. Week 11 on, led the league in PFF rushing grade. Like, we saw pretty much all of his efficiency metrics increase: yards per carry, missed forced tackle rate, yards after contact per attempt. Like, he dominated, from weeks 11 onward. And I do think that that's probably going to be more indicative of what we're going to see out of Tony Pollard than the first half of the season. So not worried about Tony Pollard, but I do want to give a quick shout out to Tajay Spears. May he rest in peace, because I am totally and completely devastated. I thought that this was going to be an interesting year for Tajay Spears. Average 4.5 yards per carry, 70 targets as a rookie, 52 receptions, 838 scrimmage yards, 26% missed forced tackle rate, 3.1 yards after contact per attempt. I was really encouraged by what we saw out of Tajay Spears in year one. Obviously, there's like some long-term health concerns there that I think probably, had some hesitation about buying into him long-term. But I honestly kind of thought that was part of the intrigue in signing a guy like him, because, a rookie, play him on his rookie deal and then you're done. I'm mourning right now. I'm in mourning.
Yeah, I feel like there was definitely some risk with Tajay Spears, right? I'm very excited about him as well. I liked him coming out even with the injury concerns. And I know that there was definitely hope that he could kind of take over with Derrick Henry out. And when we wrote up the ideal landing spots again, I think I put Josh Jacobs in Tennessee, and Nate got mad at me for killing Tajay Spears as well. So Nate, where are you at with Tajay Spears and Tony Pollard potentially sharing touches in any kind of way here in Tennessee?
Yeah, I think this is good for the Titans and bad for fantasy. You play these running back musical chairs in your head leading up to free agency. And I was hoping more of like an AJ Dillon and Alexander Madison to kind of split that workload so Spears could be the better fantasy option of the two there. But I think Pollard, like we were saying, I think he'll still be one of the better running backs in the league. I would blame last year on the injury. So I think Pollard can still be very effective, but he won't see as much playing time in Tennessee as he did in Dallas. There's more competition in Tennessee, and the offensive line isn't as good in Tennessee. So I think for a lot of reasons, we shouldn't expect Pollard to be as good as he was at the end of last season. And then similarly, Spears, we know last year he was getting all of the receiving work. Pollard's at least a little more capable of playing on receiving downs than Derrick Henry was. So even then, like, Spears was playing in every single passing situation, and now it might be a little bit more strict to third downs, or we could see just like a 2/3, 1 split between the two running backs. So obviously it'll be a situation where if there's an injury to one of the two running backs, I could see really big things for the healthy running back. But as long as the two are playing together, it's going to be hard. I think Tony Pollard can still be a fantasy starter, but it's just not ideal. Ideally, those two running backs would be the lead running backs on different teams.
I hear you. Yeah, for sure. I was very high on Tony Pollard last offseason, right? Like he was, I think, probably top 5.
We were all high on Tony Pollard last season, my man.
Of course, right? There was plenty to love, right? Especially in that Dallas offense, right? And it's just a completely different offense, right? From Dallas to Tennessee, especially the offensive line as well. So as high as I was on Tony Pollard, like Kate said, I feel like we can be closer to those expectations at the start of the year, but I'm not putting him necessarily in that RB1 territory for all the same reasons that you mentioned as well, Nate, right? Like he's probably going to be closer to like that high end RB2 for me at this point. So we'll see if anything changes this offseason, what kind of help they add to the offensive line there in Tennessee. But that's kind of where I'm at with Pollard right now. I don't want him necessarily as my RB1, but I'd be very happy with him as my RB2. All right, more signings. We got Josh Jacobs going to the Green Bay Packers. So initially, when this happened, it didn't necessarily feel great for fantasy purposes because Aaron Jones was still on the roster. But luckily, that feeling only lasted for about an hour or so because they announced that they were going to be releasing Aaron Jones. But then it turned out that they actually traded Aaron Jones. So with Josh Jacobs now basically having the run of the Green Bay backfield, we got to be feeling pretty decent about his potential here. At least I feel pretty good about it. I know last year, even another one of those guys that had a down year, but there's really nobody to be concerned about right now in Green Bay. I mean, they could still add somebody in the draft potentially, but how are you guys feeling about Josh Jacobs in Green Bay, Nate?
I'm feeling pretty good at the moment. I think there'll still be a little bit of what will happen and who they add as the other running back, but I think a lot will depend on how good the Packers offense remains heading into this season. Josh Jacobs, like every running back, plays better against lighter boxes than 8-man boxes, but his numbers have been even more extreme in Las Vegas, playing a lot worse against 8-man boxes, and when he's facing a light box, playing a lot better. So I think a lot will depend on how good the Packers passing offense is doing. That'll allow defenses to have to focus on the pass so Josh Jacobs can sneak in some quality runs. So like we saw past years with Aaron Rodgers, they were one of the top teams against facing light boxes. Last year, that changed significantly at the start of the year, but then as the year progressed, they started facing more and more 7 or fewer man boxes because the passing offense started playing better and better. So I think if Jordan Love can continue being the player that we saw at the end of last season, then Jacobs has huge potential for this year. But I think if Love takes a step back in his second year as the starter and the defenses can focus more on Jacobs, then that'll be a bit more of a problem. And then similarly, they're going to add someone because they don't really have anyone else on the roster. There are plenty of decent backup running backs still available in free agency that we won't cover, like Ezekiel Elliott. I don't know if he'll end up finding a team. Dalvin Cook, since all the rest of the NFC North has traded running backs around amongst the division, so they need to add a running back from Minnesota on the team. But and plenty of rookies that they can get as well. But as long as they don't get too good of a backup running back, that I'm feeling fairly high on Jacobs to be RB1 or potentially one of the top couple running backs this year.
Yeah, I'm with you. It's definitely going to be like an Alexander Madison or somebody like that, right? So that we can, like you said, keep that Minnesota trend and NFC North trend going and not hurt Aaron Jones too much. So, Kate, where you or Aaron Jones, Josh Jacobs, I've already got them mixed up here. Are you feeling any better about Josh Jacobs? I know last year it was a down year. As the year went on, we kind of got a little bit lower on him, and then obviously he had injuries as well. But how are you feeling about 2024, Josh Jacobs?
Yeah, I mean, 2023 Josh Jacobs, he ranked 20th percentile or lower in PFF rushing grade, missed tackles forced per attempt, yards after contact per attempt, zone rushing grade, receiving grade, drop rate, breakaway run rate. Like, this was a brutal season for Josh Jacobs. But I do want to say that 2024, if we actually see this Packers, team continue to evolve and in a positive direction, I would argue this is probably the best offense Josh Jacobs has ever played on. And honestly, maybe even the 2023 version of the Packers, probably the best offense that Josh Jacobs has ever played on. So from an efficiency standpoint, obviously, he can handle volume. He can handle, 20 plus touches a game if you're asking him to. But I do think that the way this offense and situation is evolving, again, similar to Saquon Barkley and the kind of efficiency he might find in a team like the Eagles, I think we could see something similar with Josh Jacobs to the Packers, and we could see maybe one of his most efficient seasons to date, to where, like, maybe he doesn't need 20 plus touches per game, because maybe he's a little bit more efficient with those touches in general.
Yeah, like you said, there's room here for him to have one of his better seasons. I know, 2022 he finished as what, PPR RB3, something like that. He had a huge year, right? Set career highs across the board for a lot of his rushing totals, and then unfortunately set like career lows in his rushing totals in 2023, right? So there's definitely room for him to bounce back closer to that, RB1 production that we were kind of hoping for him. And that's kind of where I'm viewing him, as a potential RB1 again this year. And then you look at Jordan Love too. There's, I think, potential for him in the passing game, right? Jordan Love was 4th in the league in pass attempts behind the line of scrimmage this past year with 121. So there's going to be targets for him as long as he is that every down back that we kind of expect him to be and that he looks to be right now when you look at the Packers roster. And Nate, like you said, that there's still obviously some additions that they can bring in, whether it's through the draft or through free agency. But I don't know that anybody that they bring in is going to be a significant threat for Josh Jacobs right now. So I'm feeling pretty good about him. Let's talk about, another running back that had a down season in 2023. There's going to be a lot of potential bounce back candidates, I think, based on this free agency and a lot of the new landing spots as well. So it's okay to be optimistic, I think, but how optimistic we will be, it remains to be seen. And Austin Eckler was our biggest fantasy disappointment from the 2023 season. I don't think it was particularly close. It just was not even close to what we got from him in 2022 and what the expectation was for 2023. So it's always going to be a little bit hard to get excited about him or too excited about him for this season. But I'll be curious, Kate, where you're at with Austin Eckler going to the Washington Commanders, signs a 2-year deal there. I think it's 4.1 million AAV. So not like a huge contract or anything like that, compared to a Saquon Barkley or Josh Jacobs. But do you think there's potential here for Eckler to get back in the good graces of fantasy managers?
I think this is really going to depend entirely on the quarterback situation. So I'm looking at their potential. Obviously, we're hearing all kinds of rumblings about where Drake May is falling in the draft, Jaden Daniels climbing up boards, JJ McCarthy climbing up boards. I think it really depends on where the Commanders ultimately lie with this. And I think, if we're talking a Jaden Daniels, I would find that a little bit more concerning. We see a lot of these more mobile rushing quarterbacks, just a lesser tendency to check down to the running back when, things aren't open down the field. So if there's a Jaden Daniels, I think this is no bueno. Also from just a team rebuilding standpoint, I wonder where is this offense actually going to be in terms of scoring potential? Obviously they have Terry McLaurin, one of the better wide receivers, although not, very safe floor, maybe not, the highest of ceilings. Jahan Dotson, total question mark. Curtis Samuel, free agent. What is this offense going to look like, and how many points are they realistically going to be scoring? Because both of Austin Eckler's most productive seasons as a running back came on the back of, a large passing volume and on a large touchdown volume. I don't know that he's going to find either of these depending on the situation at running back. And I'm probably out on Austin Eckler as much as I love the player here following this signing.
I think that's fair, right? And there's definitely question marks about what this Washington offense is going to look like. And yeah, it does. It starts with the quarterback position, but there's also Brian Robinson, who I thought performed pretty well last year, at least better than what Eckler gave us, right? And obviously Eckler, it was a really bad year. It was career lows for him basically across the board, right? So we got to assume that potentially, we don't have to assume, but we could assume that, he's going to be a little bit better, right? But Brian Robinson already showed that he can be efficient. He could be effective. It's not necessarily the largest contract either for Eckler, where the team feels, obligated to give him a significant amount of touches if they don't feel that he is being efficient or is delivering in the way that they expected. They do have somebody like a Brian Robinson there to turn to if they want to. Nate, do you have any concerns about Eckler here in Washington, or do you feel like he could be, the clear guy over a Brian Robinson?
My guess is that he will be the clear passing down back and Brian Robinson the clear rushing down back. With Cliff Kingsbury as the coach, I think of this kind of back when Chase Edmonds was at his peak, how he was rotated with James Conner at that point of time, and he's reuniting with Anthony Lynn, who's the new run game coordinator and running back coach. He was with the Chargers earlier in Austin Eckler's career when Eckler was used more specifically as a passing down back rather than an every down back. So I could very well see him not getting that rushing volume, potentially being one of the top receiving running backs in the league in terms of targets and receptions. But like you guys were saying, the touchdown production is a huge part of what made him a top fantasy running back. So I think we're probably far away from that unless they hit it big with the quarterback selection and they don't view Brian Robinson all that high, in which case Austin Eckler would be the lead guy. So I think both of those have to happen in order for him to be in the RB1 conversation anymore. Without that, I think he's someone that it'll really depend on your league size of how you're valuing him. I think he can fairly consistently put up okay numbers if you're in a league where there's 12 plus people and you have to start 2 or 3 running backs. But if you're only starting the top 20 running backs, then I don't see that ceiling for him without some pretty major things happening.
Yeah, I'm with you guys. I think like the most optimistic I can get about Austin Eckler, I think right now at this point in his career, is probably like low end RB2. I mean, we know like it's not far removed from obviously that high end RB1 potential, but that's kind of where I'm at with him right now. I don't want to get too excited about him. Low end RB2, like we'll see what his ADP ends up being. But Kate, like you said, if he starts to go, among the top 15 or so around that range, that's an area where I don't think I can get behind Austin Eckler. But if it's outside the top 20 in that low 20 range, there's probably a chance I could take a shot on him there. But we'll see what else happens and how things unfold. But there's some other running backs I like as well, and we'll talk about them too. And one of them actually is Devin Singletary, who goes to the New York Giants. Kate, we've talked about Singletary a bit this offseason, and we like him. We like him when he gets an opportunity. There's a pretty decent chance for opportunity here in New York. So how are you feeling about this signing for Devin Singletary?
It's an interesting one because I mean, not a lot of competition there in that backfield. And like, I look at the signing at face value. I really thought Singletary was going to go to a place where they had some like maybe more complementary options. And that's not really the case in New York. And I think that's what surprised me the most. I honestly wouldn't be surprised if we didn't see one of these ancillary running backs, maybe with a more refined skill set as a receiver, going to New York, because it doesn't feel like a complete backfield yet. But I mean, obviously we saw in 2023 when he was asked to step up, Dameon Pierce wasn't doing good things and then he was injured, and we finally saw Devin Singletary kind of get a full workload. And that was really, I feel like the first time we really saw him take on a full backfield, and he looked good doing it. I think, for as much heat as maybe you want to give him for his size, we're starting to see a league that's more adaptable to the idea of a smaller running back, and the idea of a smaller running back being the kind of bruiser that I think Devin Singletary can be. I'm going to be honest, like I could see it, barring whoever they bring in as this complimentary back, which again, I swear is coming. I do think Devin Singletary, if he's the primary guy, I think he's probably an RB2. And I think he's a probably like pretty safe, maybe not the highest ceiling player, because I don't see this being a high scoring offense by any stretch of the imagination. But if you're looking for a guy who might get you between 15 to 20 touches as that relatively safe, low ceiling RB2, I think Devin Singletary might be that guy. And I think because of the lack of he's not sexy, he's not flashy, he might end up actually being a value come draft season.
I hope so. I like the landing spot. Again, it's another one of those offenses that, has question marks at multiple positions. We'll see if, Daniel Jones is going to be the starter there. It feels like potentially that he is going to be the starter at quarterback. We'll see what happens. But when Singletary's been given the opportunity, he's been good, right? He's carried the ball 10 or more times in a game, 44 times for his 5-year career. He's averaged 4.5 yards per carry in those games, and which is, top 15 efficiency if you're looking at it as a season. So I like Singletary. I'm with you. I think, a weekly RB2 is a nice kind of spot for him, and I'd feel pretty good about him in that role. Nate, what about you? RB2 for Devin Singletary? You on board with this?
I think it depends on how much they invest in another running back. I think bringing him in makes a ton of sense, reuniting him with Brian Daboll, who was the Bills' offensive coordinator with Singletary from 2019 to 21. So there's a lot of familiarity there already. So I think Singletary, the nice thing about him is he's a pretty versatile back. He can be a third down back. He can be an early down back. He can do everything. So it depends what the skill set is of whoever they bring in. If it's another player that is versatile, or if it's a player who specializes in one thing or another, which could push Singletary's role in one direction or another. It's just hard for me to get too excited because of that lack of upside in the offense. We don't know what's going to happen at quarterback. We don't really know what's going to happen at wide receiver. They probably need one or two and don't have them. The offensive line's a question. Darren Waller's potentially going to retire. We don't know yet. So this could be an offense where they're going to need to throw the ball a ton and probably not wanting to check down to the running back too much. And if it's a situation where it's the middle of the season, things aren't going well and they drafted a rookie, then it might be time to see what the rookie can do. So I think definitely early in the season has that possibility of being an RB2, maybe some weeks as an RB1 here and there. But I think for the most part, once it gets to the end of the season, I don't know how much he'll be helping too many fantasy teams.
Nice. That's fair. Well, how about this player? Because Kate, I know you're a particular fan here of Mr. Zach Moss, and he goes to Cincinnati and kicks Joe Mixon out the door. Joe Mixon gets moved. Was it Mixon that was traded, or was I thinking of
Mixon was traded?
Mixon was the one traded. Yeah. All right. So yeah, like I said, it's hard to keep up, but Zach Moss gets to take over in Cincinnati for Joe Mixon. What do you think about this landing spot for your guy, Zach Moss, Kate?
I'm actually really excited about this landing spot, and it's for two reasons. A, I love Zach Moss, and that's where I'm at. I love Zach Moss. I like to see Zach Moss in a role where he can get some carries. He's the type of running back that the more volume he gets, the more opposing he is on defenses. He wears you down, and that's been his game style. So like that was part of the reason I think Buffalo was just such a poor fit for Zach Moss, because he wasn't able to get that volume consistently, which I think is what he needs as the type of power back that he is. Now, is he going to get that in Cincinnati? Because I do think they brought him in to complement Chase Brown, and Chase Brown, like, he offers you plenty of speed that I think this offense is very seriously lacking. So when I look at like the types of running backs that they paired and the way that we can project this offense, I think Chase Brown, obviously the more explosive guy. I think Zach Moss really going to be that sort of in between the tackles kind of guy. Could be a great fit.
Yeah, this is a nice fit here. I mean, we saw this team rely really heavily on Joe Mixon over the years, right? But it was pretty clear later this past season that they were going to be moving away from him, going a different route for their backfield, right? We saw them work Chase Brown in a little bit more, but Zach Moss, like you said, when he's gotten those opportunities, he's kind of shined, right? Like we saw it last year in Indianapolis. He got double-digit carries, I think 8 games, and he averaged 4.3 yards per carry, 81 rushing yards per game. He put 4 rushing touchdowns up in those games as well. So I think he's going to get a decent sized workload here in Cincinnati on a very good offense, obviously. So there's going to be opportunity to score at the goal line as well. So I'm definitely excited about Zach Moss. How about you, Nate, before we go on to our breaking news here as we're recording?
Yeah, I'm decently concerned about Chase Brown, so I think this could very well be a two-man committee where whichever running back happens to be playing better could end up having the larger role of the two. I'm concerned about the pass catching a little bit with both running backs. I know last year they started using Drew Sample in the backfield on third downs a decent amount, and they re-signed Drew Sample and added a tight end, so we could be seeing more of that. So that could be a little bit of a problem, but we did see in the past when Cincinnati was playing very well, that's a situation where the running back's going to score a ton of touchdowns. So if Zach Moss ends up being the lead guy, especially if he ends up being the goal line guy, that could be huge potential if Cincinnati's offense can get back to the way they were 2 years ago compared to where they were playing most of last year.
Nice. I like it. And as we were talking about Zach Moss, we got another running back signing happening here, as we expected would happen. And actually, it was as we expected for landing spot as well. We talked about this one in the landing spot pod. It was Derrick Henry is signing a 2-year deal with the Baltimore Ravens. So we liked this spot when we talked about it initially this offseason, just a few weeks ago. But now it's come to fruition here, and we've got Derrick Henry going to Baltimore. Initial thoughts, Nate, for Derrick Henry on the Ravens offense.
I'm excited for it, probably more so for the offense in general. Just having that good of a running back in that offense just feels like it makes a ton of sense compared to the committee that they've had in the past and the struggles they've had with running backs staying healthy. I think this should be pretty good for Henry. There's always the concern that Lamar Jackson is the quarterback. He's going to run a lot. He's going to get some of the touchdowns in there. But I think this should help, especially when you consider with the Titans, when Henry was at his best, they had one of the better offensive lines. And slowly over the years, they started losing some of those pieces. The offensive line stopped being as good, and that hurt his production in general. Tennessee last year was back to being an average or so run blocking offensive line, but the Ravens continue to be one of the better run blocking offensive lines. So I think that can be huge for Henry's production. So don't know exactly how high I'll draft him, but I think this is a good move for him and probably one of the best landing spots that he could have landed with.
Yeah, definitely feels like one of the best landing spots. Another guy, he's going to be 30 years old at the start of this season. So on the older side here, and he's got a ton of wear and tear on him as well, right? He's had to carry the ball at least 200 times in 6 straight seasons now. Ravens haven't really had somebody that's had to do that since basically Mark Ingram, although Gus Edwards came pretty close to that last year. So it's not like they're going to, go away from it because that's what they've done in the past. They've got Derrick Henry on the roster now. We know that Keaton Mitchell isn't likely to start the season. He's going to be dealing with that knee injury. So Kate, how are you feeling about Derrick Henry now that it is official? Well, I guess it's official once the free agency period officially opens, but it seems like Derrick Henry to the Baltimore Ravens is official here.
I'm all in, and I actually think I'm probably just going to be drafting him as an RB1. I know the age, the touch totals, it doesn't matter for me. Like, I think schematically, this is such a good fit. He's really shown no signs of wear and tear. And Johnny mentioned Gus Edwards, who signed with the Los Angeles Chargers. Gus Edwards has been a pretty foundational player for the Ravens, which I'm going to be honest, I just never thought we would see a day where he walked out of that building, because I thought this team they seem to really, really like Gus Edwards a lot. He's had 4 out of 5 seasons with 139 plus touches. He's been a guy that, while he's never taken over the backfield necessarily, he's had a substantial role in the offense. And I think, that availability of touches, question marks with Keaton Mitchell. I don't think a full workload for Derrick Henry is at all out of the question, barring any concerns about health. And to this point, I haven't seen any of those concerns for decline on those high volume opportunities.
Yeah. And like you said, even with Gus Edwards too, like what we loved about Gus Edwards last season was the touchdown upside as well, right? When the Ravens got down around the goal line, they were giving him the ball. He had 13 rushing touchdowns last season. I got to imagine Derrick Henry's going to be put in a similar situation here. And I mean, there's no reason that King Henry can't be as effective around the goal line as a Gus Edwards. So it's a pretty exciting landing spot, I think, for the Baltimore Ravens, and for Derrick Henry managers. If you've held on to him in Dynasty for some reason at this point, in his career, you got to feel pretty good about this, going from Tennessee to Baltimore.
I do think one small thing that could hurt his upside is the Ravens. I'd expect them to be a top 5 team in the NFL again this upcoming year. And the Ravens have pretty consistently over the years, when they've had leads, they lean more towards their younger running backs. Mm-hmm. And when they're playing from behind, lean more on their veteran running backs. So I could see this being a scenario where Henry, at his age, they want to rest him a lot in the fourth quarters when they have leads. He might not be getting those garbage time carries in order to preserve him for later in the season. So I could see him not having the same volume he had in Tennessee, but having more efficiency to make up for that.
Yeah, that's a good call. Yeah, more efficiency and hopefully more opportunities for touchdowns. Although he definitely got his opportunities for touchdowns in Tennessee there as well. So that's our new breaking news. Let's go to a player that is now, I guess, old news in comparison to some of these other players, and that is DeAndre Swift, who signed with the Chicago Bears essentially as soon as the legal tampering period opened, which is interesting. It must have been a very, very quick negotiation. But DeAndre Swift lands in Chicago, and we had some issues with the Chicago backfield this past season. It was messy at times. Nate, do you feel like DeAndre Swift coming in clears things up at all for the Chicago running back situation?
Not a ton. Like last year, we had the issue with them rotating players, but in that case, it wasn't so much they were rotating players because no one was doing well. I felt like all of the running backs they had were playing decently well, and a lot of the issues were more with the offensive line. So, like in terms of PFF grade, Swift isn't even the best running back in Chicago after signing, but a situation where they paid all this money for him, so I definitely expect him to be the starter, but I don't know how much they'll end up rotating players in and out. It's a situation where Swift had this great offensive line last year, not quite as good offensive line in Chicago, and potentially could be rotating more, and Swift was only about RB 20 or so last year. I think RB 19 maybe. So it's hard for me to get too excited about this when you see more competition in the backfield and not as a good of offensive line or not as good of an offense in general.
Yeah, that's kind of like my initial feeling on it was low end kind of RB2, high end RB3, right? Like I expect him to be the top back of these Chicago Bears options here. But like you said, I wouldn't be surprised to see Khalil Herbert or Roschon Johnson kind of working in there on a weekly basis. So Kate, are you any more optimistic about DeAndre Swift here in Chicago?
I'm not like overly excited about the signing. I do think the one kind of kicker here is the money, because he received a significant contract, and I don't think that that's not for nothing. He was one of the first names we saw signed. And I think the fact that they were willing to give him that kind of contract, despite the fact that I would argue, they had pretty decent play here in the 2023 season, even despite not having such a great offense. I thought their running backs performed well. The kind of odd man out here for me, I do think, is Khalil Herbert, who, again, I actually really like here. DeAndre Swift wasn't the most overall efficient receiver last year. We saw them lean pretty heavily on Roschon Johnson for the receiving role, but DeAndre Swift, 28th percentile in PFF receiving grade, 49th percentile in missed forced tackles per reception, 32nd in yards per route run. So I could very much see this being a situation where they use kind of the tandem of DeAndre Swift and Roschon Johnson, and Khalil Herbert is kind of the odd man out. But this Bears offense in general, I'm curious to see how they're going to handle, obviously, the situation with Justin Fields and presumably Caleb Williams. Like, there's some interesting questions left to be answered, but generally speaking, I don't think this is a move that like overly excited me, as crazy as it is.
Yeah, I'm with you. I wasn't very excited about it either. And it's interesting that you mentioned, Khalil Herbert being the odd man out, because I don't know. I felt slightly different. I think it might be Roshan Johnson. We'll see. Like, obviously, anything can happen here, but I felt like that there was probably more redundancy with what Roshan Johnson offers than what Khalil Herbert offers, and that Johnson was their primary receiving back last year. And like you said, not that DeAndre Swift's been amazing as a receiver or anything like that, but teams have basically leaned on him pretty significantly in that regard, right? He's never had below 50 targets in a season as a receiving back. So I think there's potential that he's going to eat into some of those Roshan Johnson opportunities, but I definitely get the argument for him killing Khalil Herbert more so than Johnson as well. So either way, I don't love it. Like I said, I think at best I'd consider him high end RB2. We didn't see Chicago last year when all those backs were healthy. I don't think any of them cracked over 60% of the team's offensive snaps, right? So there was definitely more of a committee there, or commitment to using multiple running backs under Matt Eberflus and Shane Waldron. But yeah, we'll see how it shakes out this year. But yeah, not overly. I think we all kind of have the same feeling here about DeAndre Swift, just not overly excited about it. How about this one? So Antonio Gibson signs with the New England Patriots. So not necessarily a team that was like in desperate need of a receiving back, because I thought Ramondre Stevenson was actually performed well in that role, but it feels like, Antonio Gibson, again, pretty much established as more of a receiving type running back at this point in his NFL career. I don't think there's necessarily concern that he's going to be a significant rushing threat over Ramondre Stevenson. But Nate, where are you at with Antonio Gibson affecting any kind of Ramondre Stevenson value here for fantasy?
I am concerned about Stevenson. I think Gibson is at least capable of running with the ball, even though he really was not used in that role this past year. But in previous years, Gibson was fine as a rusher. So I could see this being a little bit like him taking the Ezekiel Elliott role last year. But also we saw at times Elliott taking more of the receiving snaps, and that didn't go well. So then he lost those receiving snaps again, where I think Gibson is the better of the receiver among the two. So I could very well see this being a situation where Stevenson is more of a two-down back, taking most of those situations, and then Gibson taking a couple drives here and there and taking the third down role. So I think this probably hurts Stevenson's chances of being a top 15 running back, maybe even a top 20 running back. And potentially, if Gibson starts playing well and earns a couple more drives, could put Gibson in a situation where he's fantasy relevant again, where last year I included him multiple times in my 5 to add, 5 to cut as a player that could be cut last year.
Yeah, so this is not as exciting, obviously, for Ramondre Stevenson, but if, like you said, Nate, if he does take over that kind of primary receiving role, and they do just want to focus on Ramondre Stevenson as an early down back, there's potentially some PPR value there. Where are you at it with it, Kate? As far as Antonio Gibson, Ramondre Stevenson in New England, because this is another offense that does have like a bunch of question marks, and again at the quarterback position, even though they did sign Jacoby Brissett.
This is probably a backfield that I'm going to try to steer very clear of in my fantasy drafts. I'm not sure I see the upside in terms of scoring potential for this offense overall. I think there's a lot of overlap in the way that these running backs could be utilized. I think you guys are probably right. I think it's Ramondre Stevenson that's going to take on more of those first and second down situations. But because he has the receiving ability, I think this could just be a mishmashed backfield that's going to be maybe a little bit hard to predict on a weekly basis, but also what is the upside? I'm not sure. And for that reason, I'm probably out on all of them.
Yeah, hard to believe, right, that we're avoiding a New England backfield. But this has been the case with them, right? Like they love their committees there. Again, the offense is going to be probably not great. I guess, to put it lightly, right? Like Ramondre Stevenson only had 4 rushing touchdowns last year as well, right? So again, that upside might not be there. It might be even less now with Antonio Gibson coming in and potentially taking that receiving work away. And yeah, I'm with you. He was drafted in that kind of low end RB1, high end RB2 range last year. I have a hard time imagining him being in that same range this year. I think he'd be closer probably to that RB2-3 range, Ramondre Stevenson this season. And he could definitely outperform that if he does continue with the receiving work, but I would be surprised if that's the case, I guess. We touched on Gus Edwards a little bit earlier when we were talking about the Ravens and Derrick Henry, but Gus Edwards did go to a new home. He signed with the Los Angeles Chargers. Chargers were a team that obviously, again, has relied heavily on Austin Eckler in the past. Eckler's not there anymore. So a pretty big opening for the Los Angeles Chargers, a pretty large opportunity for Edwards to kind of step in here. So as things stand right now, he looks like potentially the top back in Los Angeles. So Kate, how you feel about Gus Edwards here going to the Chargers?
I'm going to be honest, it's pretty interesting. And I've been saying all off season, like I thought the fit with Jim Harbaugh. Oh my gosh. Yeah. Jesus. I thought the fit was just very interesting here because we're looking at an offense that is obviously like built around Justin Herbert. My gosh, I'm like Jim Harbaugh, Justin Herbert. There's too many H's and J's. But you look at the fit, and I didn't necessarily think that Jim Harbaugh made a ton of sense for this team if you're going to be building around Justin Herbert. Because it really just projected as a run heavy offense, right? And then you look at the addition of Greg Roman as offensive coordinator. There has only been 1 out of 10 seasons with, Greg Roman as the offensive coordinator, where that team that he was offensive coordinating hasn't ranked 28th or lower in total pass attempts. Like Greg Roman, you bring him in to establish the run. So if Gus Edwards actually does project as the lead back in this backfield, it's interesting, man. And I have to believe like there's no way that Gus Edwards can really be the guy. I wouldn't be surprised even if like because of that Michigan connection with Jim Harbaugh, they seek out Blake Corum in the draft, who probably lost a little bit of draft stock at the combine, but like this projects as a run heavy offense. And I do think if things shake out in a way that like Gus Edwards is the guy, I'm probably going to be wanting to roster him as an RB2 in fantasy and put that on a list of things I never thought I'd say in my lifetime.
Yeah, look, this is it as things stand right now. It looks really, really good for Gus Edwards. And like you said, yeah, maybe they drafted Blake Corum. I feel like that connection is going to be a common one as we go through draft season here. But I think there's potential for Gus Edwards to still lead that backfield over a rookie running back if they do bring somebody like that in. And it's like you said, with Greg Roman there as well, it's a decent offense that could allow him to thrive. And, he's not really been like a true lead back in the past, even though last year was probably the closest that he's been to that. He had over 200 carries, which included the playoffs, right? So from that standpoint, he performed pretty well. And I think he's capable of handling that workload if given that opportunity. So Nate, Gus Edwards on the Chargers here. I mean, we talked about the reasons we like him. Is there any reason that you're concerned about him at all? Or are you feeling the same way as far as optimism goes?
I think this was the best situation for Gus Edwards at the very least, reuniting with Greg Roman, where he averaged at least 5 yards per carry every season that he's been with Roman. One big concern is the offensive line, which was by far the worst run blocking in terms of PFF grade. A big problem for Austin Eckler last year, which will continue to be a problem for Edwards this year. Edwards, at least, like I was looking at carries where running backs were first contacted in the backfield or at 0 yards, and he's still one of the best running backs even in those situations, at least making sure that he can get a couple yards on those plays. But the offensive line is a concern, and also they are definitely going to add someone else. They Isaiah Spiller, I think right now is second on the depth chart just based on who's there. So they're going to bring someone else in. It'll depend who that person is. If it's a receiving back, that's probably the best situation for Gus Edwards, because we know Gus Edwards isn't going to be a third down back regardless of who they bring in. But if it's a more well-rounded player, then we might see Edwards stick to that 10 to 15 carry range like we've always been seeing in Baltimore, in which case this could be a little bit of a downgrade because of that offensive line.
Yeah, the offensive line, their run blocking obviously was abysmal last year. But yeah, right now, the way things stand, it looks very good for Gus Edwards. And I'm with you. I think there's definitely somebody that's gonna come in, but whether or not they can push Gus Edwards for touches will remain to be seen here. So we still have more running backs to talk about. Aaron Jones, who was released. No, was he traded? I've already released.
He was
yes.
released.
I think I mentioned that he was traded earlier, right? So again, all over the place here. He goes to his division rival, or the Packers division rival, in the Minnesota Vikings. And Kate, last episode, we talked a little bit about, Ty Chandler potentially now being the lead back in Minnesota. Could he do it? Well, Aaron Jones comes in, even though, 29 years old, this is still a very good running back, I think. Anyways, he still performed well. I think he finished the season with over 100 rushing yards in five straight games, including the playoffs. Averaged 4.8 yards per carry on the year, which was a top 10 mark for the entire season. So Aaron Jones, there's still some, gas left in the tank here. I don't think there's much of a question that he's going to be the lead back here in Minnesota. So how are you feeling about Aaron Jones in Minnesota?
The biggest concern for me definitely comes down to the quarterback situation now. Like, obviously, he is an older running back, 29 years old. But like you mentioned, I don't think he actually has lost a huge step in his aging career. Ranked sixth among PFF sixth among running backs in PFF rushing grade, 20th among 57 qualifying running backs in missed tackles forced per attempt, 7th in yards after contact per attempt. Like, he had a really solid season, and a much better season, I think, than you would have probably projected ahead of his age 29 year. And do I think he's got plenty more to give? Absolutely. But the real question is, what do the Minnesota Vikings do at the quarterback position? Because obviously, there's been some movement. A guy named Kirk Cousins left the team, and they've signed Sam Darnold, who, again, it's one of these moves that I still have a very hard time believing that they're actually going to be all in on Sam Darnold. But if he is, if this team is, and I will say, at least if you're rolling with Sam Darnold, you've got one of the most talented receiving cores in the league, between, Justin Jefferson, Jordan Addison. You've got, obviously a now injured TJ Hawkinson recovering from the torn ACL. But I think you have a lot of high-end receiving options that, might keep you afloat in terms of scoring potential. But all in all, I don't think it's a terrible fit. I'm not out on Aaron Jones, and I still think he's probably in RB2, which I feel like that's like the theme for this podcast for me, as I'm looking at like most of these guys right now is RB2s, and outside of King Henry, who continues to dominate forever and forever.
Yeah, there's definitely, I think a lot of players in that range at this point now, and yeah, Aaron Jones, I think, is definitely in that similar spot here, and like you said, it's a very good offense right now, probably outside of the quarterback position. So what they do at quarterback is gonna, probably change a lot, but at the same time, they have the weapons that they could still be at least capable and effective offense for Aaron Jones to get into scoring position. They may rely on him even more if they don't fill that quarterback position as well. Just as far as players being able to move the ball, Aaron Jones should, I think, get a lot of touches here in Minnesota. Ty Chandler, obviously the closest competition for backfield touches there. Not nearly the same rushing pedigree as an Aaron Jones, who now 7 seasons in the NFL, never below a 79.6 rushing grade in his NFL career, which is really, really good. So I feel pretty decent about Aaron Jones, like you said, in that kind of RB2 range. How about you, Nate?
Yeah, I think he should be projected for probably top 12 in terms of touches, just because he doesn't have all that much competition in Minnesota to get those. So I think it's like we're starting him around that high end RB2 range, but then there's so much that can go wrong if the offense does take a significant step back with Sam Darnold, and that impacts the run game. Jones has been dealing with injuries for the most part over the past year and a half in Green Bay. So the injuries are going to be a little bit of a concern, just because they were so consistent time after time. Like, you would come back for a game or two, then miss more games, and come back and miss the games. And then luckily at the end of the season, we saw that he can still do great things in an offense, but there's just a lot of things that can go wrong. But as long as nothing goes wrong, then he's a potential top 12 running back.
Right. Yeah, for sure. And that's, again, a common theme with running backs too, is everything kind of has to go right? Health is always an issue to be concerned about for the running back position. And Aaron Jones is definitely no different, especially as he gets a little bit older here. So one more running back change here that we have to cover is Joe Mixon going to the Houston Texans. So this one was the trade. He initially was reported as being released by the Cincinnati Bengals after they signed Zach Moss, but it turns out that they traded him to the Houston Texans, and there probably weren't many better backfields for Mixon to land after Moss signed with Cincinnati, and it was clear that his tenure there was going to be over. And there were certainly two, at least in the state of Texas, that he could go to, and he found his way to one of them, which is nice here, because I feel like this is a pretty decent landing spot for Joe Mixon, who I think, has kind of proven that he could be a workhorse running back in the NFL. And again, another guy that's getting a bit older, but there's absolutely, I think, potential here in an ascending offense. So how are you guys feeling about Joe Mixon in Houston? Sorry, Nate.
I'll go ahead.
Yeah.
I'll go ahead.
You take this one, because I'm not the Joe Mixon truther here, so I would love to get some unbiased weigh in here before I jump in with what I have to say.
Fair. I think he is a slight upgrade to Singletary in the backfield, and I think the big thing for me is last year we had a bit of uncertainty of who would be the lead running back at times, so it was harder to trust starting Singletary, knowing that things could be changing in the Houston backfield. So as long as they don't add another running back, I think we can trust Mixon to be the starter week in and week out and have that 2-down role. I think it's pretty clear what his role is, considering the coaching staff's remaining the same and everything. So I think having that role and having that consistency, ideally the offensive line is playing a bit better this year, and Houston's offense was playing really well. So I think he should be able to put up decent numbers in the offense, assuming he stays healthy.
Yeah, I'm with you. I feel, again, I like Joe Mixon, or at least I like the offense here that he's landed on, and I like the potential for him to get touches. So, Kate, you're not feeling as good about it. I could see it already. I could definitely see the path for him to not have to deliver on high expectations. So, lay it out for us here. How do you feel about Joe Mixon in Houston?
I'm going to be honest, like, from Joe Mixon's standpoint, Houston's probably one of the better situations he could have found himself in, right? Like, he wasn't going to go to the Ravens. They're not going to trade him to a division rival. Like, the next best thing probably would be going to a team like the Texans, who, an up and coming offense, a lot of scoring potential, two very viable threats in the receiving game to kind of take some pressure off the run. But you know what? Like, he was already playing with a really good quarterback. He was already playing with some pretty good receivers. And still, he's averaged 4.08 yards per carry throughout the course of his career. Over the past 2 seasons, among 59 qualifying running backs, he has ranked 57th in missed forced tackle rate, just 11% missed forced tackle rate. He's ranked 54th among 59 qualifying running backs in yards after contact per attempt. 32nd among 59 running backs in PFF rushing grade. That's the 46th percentile. Like, I am not a fan of Joe Mixon. I honestly, I'm probably so disappointed by this move, because I thought the Texans in this market had an opportunity to do a lot better, because Joe Mixon, I think at this point in his career, like he needs as much rushing volume as he can get, and he's probably going to get it. To be fair, like they took on his contract, which like I don't think you do that at this point if you're not planning to make him your every down type of running back. But I mean, goodness gracious, he's not an efficient running back, and I think my pure disgust literally just comes from me wanting to see the Texans do something a little bit better, because I think Joe Mixon is like the most washed running back in this entire class.
Yeah, so we talked about, Houston and other running backs going there this offseason, right? We were excited about them bringing in another one of these kind of big names. We felt like there was definitely potential there for them to bring somebody in because we like the offense so much, because there was going to be opportunity there. Joe Mixon ends up being the name. I know not the one you like, but for me, yeah, I'm banking on that kind of volume as well, right? So with Devin Singletary gone, there's going to be at least 60% of those carries available on a weekly basis. I'd expect it to be higher than that because I'm not necessarily a believer in what else they have there. He's averaged 288 carries and 70 targets over the past 3 years. That volume alone has been something that has kind of been his calling card, right? And it's something that I think Houston's aware of, something that Houston can rely on as well. And it's allowed him to deliver top 12 PPR points per game for the position in each of those 3 seasons as well. So for that reason, I like Joe Mixon. I definitely get he's not necessarily the most efficient running back, but I kind of still like him in that similar range as where we were drafting him last year, in that kind of high end RB2 range with some potential upside depending on if that offense can continue to click and give him some opportunities around the goal line as well.
I'd also add, out of all these teams that we're talking about, Houston's probably one of them that I'd be more worried of them adding another running back in the draft. I think them and the Chargers, a lot of these other teams like the Eagles, not expecting them to add another running back. The Packers will add somebody, but like Washington, Cincinnati very well probably won't add running backs, but I could very well see Houston getting someone 3rd, 4th round that if they start playing better than Mixon, then all of a sudden Mixon disappears.
Yeah, it's fair. And they're a young team, right? So it makes sense for them to, again, just continue to lean towards younger players as well, right? It's nice to have that kind of veteran presence in there as somebody like a Joe Mixon, but he's not a forever player there. So we could definitely see some changes. But yeah, as of right now, I feel okay about it. But I mean, it's hard to believe that there's any running backs left in the free agent market at this point. I feel like we've covered them all. There's a few remaining names like J.K. Dobbins, A.J. Dillon, Alexander Madison. Is there anybody particularly left that you guys are interested in? Because there's at least the Dallas Cowboys haven't done anything at the running back position, right? So there's at least one really good landing spot available. Any of these guys, would you be excited about landing in Dallas? Kate?
Yeah. No. But like I like, to be fair, whatever they end up doing at the running back position, I'm probably going to want to roster that player, right?
Sure.
Like just based on the fact that this is a high scoring offense with a capable quarterback. Like, I think for as much flack as we want to give Mike McCarthy, like this offense has been generally pretty solid. It's just really fun to make fun of Mike McCarthy. So like whoever lands here, I'm going to want to roster them. But like, it's really hard for me to stomach the fact that this is the group of players that they would actually be choosing from. Like, I have to imagine that they're trying to orchestrate some sort of trade for who, I don't know. But like, the idea that this really, really good offense that wants to win a Super Bowl is going to do it on the backs of one of these guys, I don't buy it. If I have to pick one, probably A.J. Dillon. But again, like, been a guy that I think for, as much as my strengths as he has, like lots of ups and downs throughout his career. He's had moments where he's looked like a glorified RB1. He's had moments where he looks like a 3rd string. And, J.K. Dobbins, obviously the best of the bunch if he were healthy. But I mean, we're talking about a guy who, correct me if I'm wrong, hasn't even had 300 carries to this point in his career because he's never been healthy. The ACL, the complications from the ACL, now the torn Achilles. Like, I'm not going to be overly interested in that if I'm the Cowboys, especially from the standpoint that I need a reliable rusher. Like, I don't know. They have to do something else at the position, right? They have to.
There's got to be something coming. I'm here for the AJ Dillon signing, just for the juxtaposition of seeing him and Deuce Vaughn on the sidelines together. I'm sure there would be plenty of pictures of that. But you got to think that Dallas is going to add a running back, whether it's through free agency or whether they give us some hope and add in the draft, and invest heavily in a running back in the draft, because right now we need a really nice rookie landing spot, and Dallas could be that spot if it happens. But Nate, where are you at with this remaining very small group of remaining free agent running backs, and the Dallas Cowboys?
Yeah, I think some of them will probably have to wait until after the draft to find a landing spot. I think Dallas, my hope is maybe a trade for Khalil Herbert after what Chicago did. That would probably be my favorite thing that they can do. I think the most straightforward thing is they bring back Ezekiel Elliott and draft someone, because Elliott's going to be available and Jerry Jones loves him. Just one last thing to add with running backs before we move on to other positions. I think Zamir White's probably one of the biggest winners so far, because the Raiders were probably the one other team that I penciled in as potentially wanting a running back. And like a lot of these running backs we talked about, you can make a chain of this guy went to this team, which then went to this team, and go on. And the Raiders were basically one of the two teams that are at one of the ends of the chains that lost a running back but haven't added a running back. So Zamir White penciled in as the clear 2-down back for Las Vegas right now. And if they don't add anyone, then he's someone that can be in that RB2, high-end RB3 conversation.
Nice. Yeah, we talked about Zamir White a little bit last episode as well, and talked about how Las Vegas didn't necessarily feel like somebody that was going to, invest heavily in the running back position, just where they're at as a franchise and as a roster right now. So it makes sense that Zamir White will have that opportunity into 2024, and we'll see what else they do. But like you said, there's not also many names remaining that they can add that are significant threats either. So that's going to cover the running back position. Just an hour and 12 minutes of talking about running backs. Yeah, there'll be another signing, I'm sure, here in a few minutes. But yeah, before we move on to the other positions, I do want to give a shout out to our presenting sponsor. Over an hour in, our presenting sponsor gets a shout out. It's Fabric by Gerber Life. If you have a family, you need to get term life insurance to protect them. It's one of the smartest financial decisions you can make. And the start of the new year is the perfect time to get it done, so you can focus on whatever else the year has in store for you. Fabric was designed by parents for parents to help you get a high quality, surprisingly affordable term life insurance policy in less than 10 minutes. Fabric has flexible policies that fit your family and your budget, with quality policies like $1 million in coverage for less than $1 a day. Get your personalized quote in just minutes and then apply when it's convenient for you. It's all online and on your schedule. You can go from start to covered in less than 10 minutes with no health exam required. Join the thousands of parents who trust Fabric to protect their family. Apply today in just minutes at meetfabric.com/fantasy. That's meetfabric.com/fantasy, meetfabric.com/fantasy. Policies issued by Western Southern Life Insurance Company. Not available in certain states. Prices subject to underwriting and health questions. All right. Other positions, they do exist, and the quarterback position is one of them. Probably one of the biggest signings of the week as well. It is Kirk Cousins, who signs with the Atlanta Falcons. And hey, we got another one right when we were talking about our ideal landing spots, Kate. We talked about Kirk Cousins potentially signing with the Falcons if he didn't stick around in Minnesota. We loved the idea of Kirk Cousins going to Atlanta. So now that it's official, how do you feel about Atlanta and their receiving weapons here, Kate?
I'm back in on Kyle Pitts, baby.
Nice. There you go.
I love to get hurt, and I'm like, I think there have been a lot of things that have contributed, obviously, to the situation that Kyle Pitts found him in, right? Like, he wasn't healthy. I suffered a knee injury that I still don't think, even after returning, was healthy at a fully at that point. But over the past 3 seasons, Kyle Pitts has ranked dead last among qualifying tight ends with a 67.5 catchable target rate. Dead last among tight ends. Now, we're going to pair him with Kirk Cousins, who the third lowest inaccurate uncatchable pass rate among 44 qualifying quarterbacks in that span. Come on. Like, if Kyle Pitts is healthy, we might see the guy that we've been trying to draft for the last several years, but just hasn't, been working out.
That's been one of the
Am I
biggest
alone?
issues, right?
Like,
No, no,
am I
not
the
at
only
all.
one here that's back in on Kyle Pitts?
I'm optimistic. I'm with you. Kyle Pitts, Drake London. It's wheels up as far as I'm concerned, because you look at the last 2 years, like you said, it's been the inaccuracy that's been one of the biggest issues from the quarterback position. Kirk Cousins, one of the best in the league as far as accuracy goes. So once he's healthy and he's under center, I have total faith that we should see a much better seasons from Kyle Pitts and even Drake London. And the combination of a huge upgrade at quarterback and the I guess firing of Arthur Smith is probably the best case scenario here, right? For Kyle Pitts managers, because those were two of the biggest issues last year, was just the I guess inconsistent playing time, and then obviously the inaccuracy from the quarterback position as well. So I'm excited about both of these guys. I mean, even Bijan Robinson, it's Kirk Cousins, not a mobile quarterback, obviously. I don't think he's going to be more mobile now that he's got this leg injury either. So Bijan Robinson should still, again, get plenty of opportunities. The offense should be better. I don't know. Is it wheels up for everybody, Nate? Are you in the same boat here?
Oh, yeah, I think Drake London as well also suffered somewhat from those inaccurate passes and should benefit from this move. I think one of the nice things about Cousins is, as excited as we are about this offense, we're still probably not ranking him among the top 12 quarterbacks because he doesn't have that rushing upside. He should continue to kind of be the guy that he was in Minnesota, where he's probably outperforming his draft position, but just doesn't have that high chance of being a top 5 quarterback. So he's probably someone that you can draft with someone that's maybe a little bit more risky, that has that high upside, that like maybe an Anthony Richardson, for example, where you can just kind of pick based on your matchups each week, which one of the two you're starting. So I think that's a nice thing that you'll be able to do with him at quarterback.
Yeah, I love that. And that was one of the reasons we like Cousins to Atlanta too, right? Like it's going to be hard leaving that receiving core in Minnesota, but he gets a really nice one here in Atlanta as well. So like you mentioned, Drake London definitely suffered from the inaccuracy. 2022, he ranked 46th out of 53 wide receivers in catchable target rate at 68.4%. It was worse in 2023, 67.9%, which ranked 48th out of 54 qualifying wide receivers in catchable target rate as well, per our numbers. So yeah, there should be a nice upgrade here. I'd be pretty excited about these guys with Kirk Cousins at the helm, but like you said, it probably doesn't move the needle too much for Kirk Cousins fantasy value, and hopefully he's able to start the season. It seems like he's on the right track there. So yeah, let's talk about another quarterback move that happened, and this one was a trade. Russell Wilson, or no, it was not a trade. What am I talking about? He was released and then he was signed by the Pittsburgh Steelers. So Kate, your Pittsburgh Steelers go from Kenny Pickett to Russell Wilson. How are you feeling about Russ being the new QB1 in Pittsburgh?
Well, I don't know, guys. There's a lot of rumor on the streets that say he is competing with Kenny Pickett. No, he's not. No, he's not. Like, literally, stop. That has to be a catchphrase that the Pittsburgh Steelers have coined in order to try to preserve any sort of perceived value that Kenny Pickett is a starting caliber quarterback, so that maybe they could trade him or do something else. Like, I actually think this is a pretty solid fit on both ends. I like the fit with Arthur Smith. I like the fit with this, running back tandem that I think is going to help, complement the use of play action. I think schematically, from a financial standpoint, like, this move just made too much sense not to make. And I mean, guys, you like George Pickens owners have to be absolutely thrilled. Because I mean, even Cortland Sutton, who, I actually kind of generally think of them as sort of like having a similar playing style. They're not necessarily every down guys, but they're guys that can make these splash plays. He had 10 receiving touchdowns with Russell Wilson last year. I think this is kind of huge for the whole offense. Like, you literally can't get much worse than you did with Kenny Pickett as a passer. Huge upgrade in my book, and I'm feeling kind of good as a Steelers fan, but I got to say the bar was pretty low for me to begin with.
Well, I'm glad that you're optimistic that bar is hopefully higher now for the Steelers going forward. Where are you at with Russell Wilson and his receiving weapons, Nate?
Just to confuse you even more, he still hasn't been cut yet. He's still technically on the Broncos roster. He's not going to be cut until after the calendar year changes for the league. But I do think this is going to be decent for Wilson. I am a little more concerned about George Pickens just because Wilson, at the best he was one of the better deep ball throwers to Tyler Lockett, but he hasn't been as accurate on his deep passes in the last couple of seasons. And George Pickens has been one of the best deep receivers in the league the past 2 years. In terms of like the percentage of his receiving production that comes on deep catches, he's among the top top wide receivers in the league. And Kenny Pickett, a lot less accurate on shorter passes than Russell Wilson is, but his accuracy on deeper passes was better than what Wilson has been the last couple of seasons. So I am a little concerned that this doesn't help George Pickens quite as much. It does depend a little bit on what happens in the offense with Allen Robinson leaving. Deontay Johnson is apparently available via trade. So if they change Pickens' role in the offense, and this could be huge for him, but if they continue to view him more as just that deep threat, then that's a little concerning. I am excited about what this can do for Jaylen Warren as a receiving running back. Both the coaching change as well as the quarterback change. Russell Wilson checked down to running backs a ton these past couple years. And then also with Arthur Smith as the coordinator, in terms of first read passes to running backs, that was something that he was doing a lot in Atlanta. So this could lead to both more plays where Warren is the expected target on the play, as well as more plays where Warren gets checked down to. So I think the offense in general is going to rely a lot on both running backs, but I do think the change at quarterback as well as coordinator both help Warren going forward.
Nice. Yeah. And Wilson, we talked about Jordan Love, fourth most pass attempts behind the line of scrimmage. Wilson was right behind him in fifth. So there's definitely opportunity there. I do appreciate Nathan, Jaylen Warren truther through and through. So sharing that nugget for us. And it's hard, right? Because Russell Wilson last year specifically, just not attempting a lot of deep passes, right? I think he earned a decent grade. It was in the 90s as far as when he did throw deep, but like you said, the accuracy there's still an issue. A lot of short passes on the below average side as far as average depth of target goes too. For me, I do like it for Deontay Johnson as well. If we're all picking somebody, Nate's got Jaylen Warren, Kate's got George Pickens. I like Deontay Johnson from this group. He did most of his damage in those intermediate areas of the field, saw 6.7% target rate in that area, earned a 90.3 receiving grade on those intermediate targets. And that's kind of where Cortland Sutton actually thrived as well. 6 of his 10 touchdowns came on those intermediate depth targets. He had a 45% target rate in that area of the field as well. So I think there's definitely potential there for Deontay Johnson. If he could get to the 10 touchdowns, I think it would be making up for lost time, but he did at least bounce back from those 0 touchdowns that he had in 2022 last year. With I think he had 5 last year. So there's definitely room here to be excited about certain players in this offense as they move away from guys like Kenny Pickett and Mason Rudolph at quarterback. So we'll see what Russell Wilson could do. He's far removed from the MVP of the Super Bowl type guy, but he wasn't an MVP of the Super Bowl winning quarterback there with the Seattle Seahawks. It hasn't been the same player over the past 3 years, but potential for new life here in Pittsburgh. All right, we did get other quarterback signings. I'll be curious what you guys think about these. We'll kind of bunch them together here because these could be just potential bridge quarterback deals here. Gardner Minshew to the Las Vegas Raiders, Sam Darnold to the Minnesota Vikings, Jacoby Brissett to the New England Patriots. I don't know that there was anybody else at the quarterback position unless I missed. Marcus Mariota to the Washington Commanders was another one. Any belief in any of these guys potentially being starting quarterbacks in 2024 to start the year?
No.
A very somber no from Kate.
I think out of all these guys, Jacoby Brissett,
Mhm.
especially if I were one of these quarterback needy teams who maybe didn't have like a top pick, I would have been courting Jacoby Brissett pretty hard here. But even Jacoby Brissett landed in a spot that could very reasonably trade up into, like they, not that they're going to trade for, Caleb Williams, but like
Right.
they can very easily walk away with a top 3 quarterback in this draft. And maybe they go with Marvin Harrison Jr. I think there's about a million different ways that you can handle it, but you know, I think that was sort of the one free agent that I was very intrigued by as a potential starter if he got the opportunity. But just given the Patriots position here in the draft order, I just don't see a realm of possibilities where he actually walks away as the starter.
Yeah, third overall pick in the draft. They're definitely going to be in position here, and then maybe they move up too with Washington. Who knows? But there's going to
Depends
be
on
options.
who they fall in love with, I think. But like regardless of what they do, they're going to be in position. So
Yeah,
like it's really hard to imagine them even being in a position to draft Marvin Harrison. It's still really hard to envision them passing up on one of these quarterbacks.
yeah. No, I hear you for sure. Nate, where are you at with this group? And yeah, thoughts on Jacoby Brissett potentially starting here in New England?
Yeah, I think at least one of these quarterbacks will have to end up starting, and like some of them just depending on how the team's philosophy is versus of starting a veteran versus starting a first round rookie week 1 kind of thing. I want to throw Denver in there as well. I think Jarrett Stidham is their quarterback currently, and they haven't added anyone else. The Giants, Daniel Jones is healthy to start the year. They at least met with Russell Wilson. So there's at least 5 teams, if you assume Chicago and Washington will draft quarterbacks first and second, at least 5 other teams that either added one of these bridge quarterbacks or could need a quarterback. Not all of them are going to be able to get a quarterback in the first round. So there's going to be at least 1 or 2 or even 3 of these teams that are kind of left out. And like I could see the Patriots, for example, trading back because they know there's so much that they need in the offense. And like, yeah, they could draft a rookie, but they're not in position to win this year. They're not quite in position to win next year. So it might not even make sense to get a quarterback. It could make sense to just roll with Jacoby Brissett, in which case, whichever of these guys are left out are probably going to be ranking like 30th, 31st, and 32nd in our rankings heading into the year. So you're only going to be drafting them as your last options in Superflex leagues. But I wouldn't be surprised if we see at least 1 or 2 of these quarterbacks starting in week 1.
Well, so yeah, it'll be interesting. We'll see what happens. Obviously, in the draft is probably going to be the biggest indicator for these teams here. But yeah, Jacoby Brissett. I know New England was looking at potentially adding Calvin Ridley. That one hasn't come through yet. They're picking third. If they do get Marvin Harrison Jr. and Calvin Ridley, does that make Jacoby Brissett more interesting? Jacoby Brissett's been decent when he's had to fill in small spurts, including the end of last year, right? So I don't know. Maybe there's some potential there. If it does happen, it might not be the end of the world. I don't think our expectations are too high for New England's offense, anyways, based on our discussion today. So we'll see what happens. A few other quarterbacks that are still on the market too: Ryan Tannehill, Jameis Winston, Joe Flacco, potentially Justin Fields. We'll see. Nothing coming through yet as far as trades or anything like that goes. I don't know that. I don't think that they'll wait right up until the draft. We should probably see something from what they plan to do with Fields, I'd imagine, before then. But any interest in any of these remaining free agent quarterbacks?
I'll just mention a quick correction. Jameis Winston did sign earlier today with
Oh,
Cleveland to be the backup, presumably,
interesting.
until he plays better than Deshaun Watson and he can become the starter.
Inevitably, yeah. All right. Let's move to the tight ends here quickly. Nothing too crazy, but some interesting landing spots at least, right? So starting with Zach Ertz, who signed with the Washington Commanders. They also released Logan Thomas. So opportunity there for Zach Ertz in Washington. We saw him obviously got injured last year, but when he was in, he looked like a pretty decent player and it was fantasy relevant. Do you think he can maintain any fantasy relevance here with the Commanders? Again, obviously another situation where we don't know what the quarterback's going to look like.
I'm like a little bit less, you know, stoked about Zach Ertz, just given the age, given the situation, given the question marks around the offense. I'm not overly interested, though I acknowledge, like, in the time that we saw him healthy last season, didn't necessarily look as old as he is. But from like a projection of how involved are we going to actually expect him to be in the offense, I'm not holding my breath. And he's one of these guys that I could picture, even with the ultimate training camp hype, probably not going to be drafted in a ton of fantasy leagues this year.
Yeah, I'm with you there. Nate, how about Jonnu Smith to the Miami Dolphins? Miami, not a team that has necessarily utilized the tight end all that much. Any interest in a Jonnu Smith who outperformed Kyle Pitts at times last year? Any interest in him in Miami's offense?
Yeah, like all of these guys, I'm not going to be ranking them near my top 12, but all of them, I feel like you can like talk yourself into, here's the scenario where they could be in the top 12. And I think in Miami, with the high power passing offense that they have, Smith does have some talent. We've hoped he'd be a breakout guy for a number of years, and he had those really big games. So there's a chance, just because he's more talented as a receiver than the tight ends that they've had in Miami recently, that he could get more involved in the offense. And there's no clear third receiver on the team, so he could take that role as a clear third receiver in a high-powered passing offense. So there's a chance he could put up some pretty big numbers some weeks, but I think it could be similar to Atlanta, where we just have no idea when those weeks will happen, so we're never starting him, and he just sits on your bench when he's getting those 100-yard games.
Yeah. And that's kind of how I feel about Mike Gesicki going to the Bengals as well, right? Like, this is another team that there's been moments where the tight end has been fantasy relevant, but it's been small sample size, right? And then they keep bringing in new guys every year, whether it's Hayden Hurst or Irv Smith or now Mike Gesicki. So he's another one that, again, you probably could talk yourself into reasons to like him for, where he'll be drafted. But when you're actually looking to start him on a weekly basis, I think it becomes a lot more difficult. And Tyler Boyd potentially going to be a free agent now. T. Higgins might get traded. So with those things, potentially being less barriers for Mike Gesicki, is there any interest from either of you guys in targeting a Mike Gesicki now that he signed with the Cincinnati Bengals?
The Cincinnati Bengals are just a team that hasn't utilized the tight end as heavily as you would like. They haven't featured that tight end. Now, I'm going to say, if there is a maybe displacement of targets via a trade for a guy like T. Higgins, who's obviously been a centerpiece of the offense, targets are totally earned, but Mike Gesicki might have more opportunities to run more routes. Obviously, you have the departure of Tyler Boyd. Like, that probably to me is the most intriguing aspect of this signing of Mike Gesicki, because he can basically just sort of function as a big slot receiver. And with the departure of Tyler Boyd, or presume he could resign. You never know, but that to me is probably the most intriguing option. Not necessarily them using him as an inline tight end, but maybe using him as the Tyler Boyd replacement.
Yeah, could be interesting, right? Like that's the thing. It's, again, a very good offense. There's potential for snaps there, again, depending on what they do. I don't, as a team that basically lost all of their tight ends in free agency, although they did bring back Drew Sample, but I don't necessarily worry too much about Drew Sample as far as a receiving threat. So there's room for Mike Gesicki there if you're looking to take a swing on one of these guys late. Anybody else here? Will Dissly, Colby Parkinson, any interest there?
Feel like Colby Parkinson fits the same kind of thing of like, yeah, he hasn't really done much in his career, but if the Rams need a tight end, they started to move a little away from Tyler Higbee. And we know Higbee hasn't been the most talented tight end throughout his career, but he has put up top 10 fantasy numbers throughout his career at times. So there's a chance that if Parkinson is utilized in a similar way, that they throw him a ton of targets.
Fair enough. All right. I think we'll move on to there's only Gerald Everett remaining at the tight end position, but nothing too interesting there, I feel like, as far as landing spots go. So we'll move to the wide receivers. Before we do, Kate, I know you got time commitments here, so we'll send you off. We're going long, obviously, with the NFL just making it more and more work for us here as all these signings come in immediately to try to get them into one episode. So we'll let you go. I appreciate you hopping on here to record with us. Before you go, please make sure you plug your work as well and let people know where they could find you.
Yeah, sure thing. Follow me on Twitter at Kate Magdziuk. That's Magdziuk, not how you would ever guess that pronunciation. But yeah, give me a follow on Twitter. I work in Steeler stuff over at Behind the Steel Curtain, occasional appearances here at PFF in the writing game. So yeah, follow my work, and thanks for having me, y'all.
Appreciate it, Kate. Thanks so
Have a
much.
good one.
All right, let's go to those wide receivers now, Nate. And let's start with the first one because this was the trade that came through before the legal tampering period. So I feel like we got to touch on it here. Jerry Jeudy gets traded from the Denver Broncos to the Cleveland Browns. Now, Jeudy, obviously, pretty big disappointment last year for fantasy purposes, not nearly what anybody would have expected from him. Even, the people that weren't overly optimistic about him, I think he's still even disappointed in that regard. So heading to the Cleveland Browns here, he's going to be paired with Amari Cooper, David Njoku, Deshaun Watson. How do you feel about Jerry Jeudy's potential fantasy value on the Browns?
I don't feel all that much stronger about it just because there's so many other weapons that you just listed in Cleveland. Ideally, Nick Chubb is healthy as well, and they can focus a lot on the run game too. So obviously, Jeudy still has that talent that we saw in college that we hoped would translate to the NFL. Maybe a change of scenery is what he needs in order to turn his career around. So I definitely not ruling out that possibility, but when there's so many other wide receivers with high upside as well, probably not going to be valuing him all that highly, but there's certainly a chance that he could have a big year in Cleveland.
Yeah, that's kind of the thing, right? Like I feel like the upside is kind of diminished with him, like as far as what to expect from him. Like I feel like wide receiver 3 at best is the hope, especially on this offense specifically, right? You got Amari Cooper there who's commanded at least 125 targets in both seasons that he's been with the team. You have David Njoku had 131 targets last year. And then Deshaun Watson as well, who just hasn't really shown a ton of potential that he could get back to that 2020 form when he was with Houston. Elijah Moore, it probably makes him obviously it crushes his value a little bit. He saw over 100 targets this past year, so hard to get too excited about Elijah Moore as well in this offense. So Jerry Jeudy for me, I think it's just somebody that I'd be looking to avoid. He's kind of like a wait and see here. If he outperforms expectations or does look a lot better, I'd be fine, drafting him the year after that. But I'm okay missing on Jerry Jeudy this year if he somehow miraculously has an amazing season in Cleveland. But he does leave a bit of an absence on the Denver Broncos, who now could potentially be using somebody in a very similar role. Cortland Sutton's still there. What do you think about Marvin Mims, who we talked about in the offseason? We covered him in articles and stuff around the draft about him potentially being the best deep threat in that 2023 rookie class. And he showed that in flashes this year, but just never got like a consistent opportunity to be fantasy relevant and to be, startable in any kind of fantasy setting, really. So with Marvin Mims potentially stepping into that Jerry Jeudy role, are you feeling any more optimistic about rostering him for fantasy purposes?
A little bit. They did restructure Tim Patrick, and Patrick has missed a ton of time, but when he last played, he was a fairly good receiver, so would expect him to see a decent amount of playing time. I think obviously the quarterback situation will depend on how excited we are, and there's really not many quarterbacks that they can get left that would be too exciting for Denver's offense. And then also, like at this point, with how good the wide receiver class is viewed and how deep it is, I'm basically assuming every team is going to get at least one wide receiver at some point during the draft. So how much they invest in another wide receiver. So I think a lot can change between now and then, but at least for the time being, he's clearly a top 3 wide receiver on the depth chart and has talent. So any wide receiver in that situation where they're highly drafted and have the playing time are worth considering.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. There's definitely a long way to go here, and the draft is going to be a huge part of that. So we'll see what happens. But yeah, Denver without anybody really at quarterback right now, it's going to be hard to get excited about the receiving weapons. Um, okay, how about a team that does have a quarterback? Actually, they got two now. They just traded for Mac Jones as well. Gabe Davis signs with the Jacksonville Jaguars. It doesn't seem like Calvin Ridley is going to be back with the team. Gabe Davis, obviously, he's kind of been that deep threat in Buffalo for the past few years. Are personally, I have a hard time getting excited about Gabe Davis. I still view him kind of as that boom bust wide receiver 3, right? Just you look at his route tree, you look at how he's utilized. He's very much like kind of the go route guy. He doesn't do a lot in the short and intermediate areas of the field. So I don't know if it's just he's not capable of doing it, or if a team's just, or the Buffalo Bills just didn't want to utilize him in that area. So I'll be curious what your thoughts are on Gabe Davis going to Jacksonville. Does this improve his fantasy value at all?
Yeah, my opinion could change a lot in the next couple minutes. I've been keeping an eye on X throughout this, and there are reports that Calvin Ridley is down to either New England or a return to Jacksonville.
Oh,
so my view on Davis will entirely depend on if Calvin Ridley returns to Jacksonville or not. At the time being, he is the clear top outside receiving option in Jacksonville. Christian Kirk and Evan Ingram will still see a ton of targets in the middle of the field. But if they don't add anyone else, I could see Gabe Davis's role changing a little bit in Jacksonville compared to what it was in Buffalo, and having a little bit more versatility in his route tree, where he should see more targets consistently than what he was seeing in Buffalo, where Buffalo, it was clear Stephon Diggs was the top outside receiver. It was an offense that also valued slot receivers a lot. They just added Dalton Kincaid. So we saw those games where Davis had, I think, 5 games of 90 plus yards and a touchdown, and then 5 games where he didn't catch a pass. So I don't think we'll see those games where he's not catching passes if he's the top outside receiving option in Jacksonville. But if they do add Calvin Ridley back, then I think Zay Jones is the odd man out. Gabe Davis would go back to being more of just that deep threat, allowing Calvin Ridley to have more of the versatile role and the inside receivers doing their thing. So in that case, I think Davis isn't going to see as many targets, but if Davis is the top outside guy, then that's a great situation for him, since there probably weren't many other teams where he'd have an opportunity to be the top outside guy.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to look at it, right? Like a potentially better floor for Gabe Davis, assuming Calvin Ridley doesn't come back, right? But yeah, still seeing that kind of high upside as a deep threat. But yeah, for me, I think, if Calvin Ridley doesn't come back, I like it a lot more for somebody like Christian Kirk and even Evan Ingram, I think, to just get more volume of targets. Like I think they're like you said, I think it makes sense that Gabe Davis sees more targets than what he saw in Buffalo, but I particularly like it for Christian Kirk and Evan Ingram, just because I think he'll still be utilized in that kind of go route role that we saw in Buffalo, even though there'll likely be some more targets in the intermediate areas of the field. We would hope for Gabe Davis, especially, signing a relatively large contract as well. So, all right, so that is Gabe Davis in Jacksonville. There weren't many other wide receiver signings. We did get one more just before we recorded, and that was Darnell Mooney going to the Atlanta Falcons and just continuing to build up their offense there now with Kirk Cousins under center. They didn't really have like a significant wide receiver 2 next to Drake London, although you can say that Kyle Pitts is probably the wide receiver 2 there. That's the way I'm kind of approaching this group. So any interest in Darnell Mooney for fantasy purposes in Atlanta's new offense?
I'd be fine with a late round flyer on him just to see how he ends up getting utilized there. Atlanta, probably the team coming into free agency that most needed more wide receivers. There were a ton of teams that are losing one of their top 3 guys. And with the draft the way it is, it's not surprising that we haven't seen much wide receiver movement. I wouldn't be surprised if we don't see a lot of movement until after the draft, with so many teams thinking they might draft 1 or 2 wide receivers. But the Falcons, like last year, like you said, they had the clear Drake London top wide receiver, and then they had 4 or 5 different guys who were rotating in and out, and all of them are free agents. So coming into free agency, basically they had no one left on the depth chart after Drake London. So Mooney should be a clear starter. They continue, if Zach Robinson does what they did in Los Angeles, where they're in 11 personnel almost all the time, then Mooney, even if he falls down to the third wide receiver spot for whatever reason, should see a ton of playing time. So it's hard for me to get too excited for him because they have so many. They have the 3 top 10 draft picks from recent drafts. That should be the top 3 priorities for the offense, which means Mooney at best is priority number 4, but priority number 4 could be good enough in this offense, depending on how good it's doing.
Yeah, that's the thing. That's the thing that helps with a quarterback upgrade as well, right? Priority 4 under Desmond Ridder, for example, you have 0 interest in. Under Kirk Cousins, it might be a little bit better, but still not anything too exciting. But like you said, there's a ton of opportunity available here in Atlanta. They lost the second highest percentage of wide receiver routes run from 2023 to this free agency class at 58%. So pretty decent chunk of snaps available for somebody like a Darnell Mooney to show that he could potentially be more than a deep threat here in Atlanta. But other than that, other key remaining names in the wide receiver market are Marquise Brown, Calvin Ridley, Odell Beckham Jr., Tyler Boyd, Curtis Samuel, Michael Thomas. Anybody else that you think could get a decent landing spot here and that you'd be excited about for fantasy purposes?
I think Marquise Brown is probably the only one that I'm, outside of Ridley, of course, that should find a landing spot sooner rather than later that I think would have good fantasy value. If Kansas City decides to sign someone, that's probably the biggest one as well. But outside of that, I think it'll be see where everyone gets drafted, and then the teams that weren't able to get the wide receiver they wanted will end up with a veteran, or once they realize there's so many guys that, like we listed 5 or 6, but there are a ton of players who saw significant playing time last year. Plenty of them that didn't have that much fantasy relevance, but they should find themselves in decent roles come into next season.
Yeah, I'm with you. And yeah, Marquise Brown, definitely an interesting name for me as well. I think there's potential there in the right offense. We talked about him in the Ideal Landing Spots podcast and talked about Kansas City potentially being a decent spot for him if he were to go there. So still a possibility. I'm holding out hope if he does land there, but a lot of other places as well could use some wide receiver help. So we'll see how things unfold here in the coming weeks, but that is going to do it. At least we should probably turn this thing off before more signings come in and we go even longer. But
we got the DJ Dallas signing to Arizona just in the last couple minutes.
Oh no, I can't talk about DJ Dallas. But yeah, I appreciate everybody tuning in and listening. Near 2-hour episode here because the NFL just gave us so much to talk about. But this might be one of those episodes you put on 1.5 times speed and helps you get through it a little bit quicker here, get all the information in there in a timely manner. But thank you again, everyone, for tuning in. Thanks to Kate for coming on as well, talking some fantasy with us. Nate as well, making his triumphant return to the podcast here in time for free agency. And I'm sure we'll get you on again before the draft and around the draft as well. And if we get another massive wave of free agent signings, I don't know how many players are left at this point, but we might have to get you on again to cover it all. So Nate, thank you for coming on here, and please remind everybody what you got up on pff.com now.
Sure. So today I had 5 biggest winners and losers of free agency from a fantasy football perspective. So the guys that I saw their value either increase or decrease based on all the things that have happened. It was focused on all the moves that happened yesterday, not so much all the moves that have happened so far today. But glad to see that we hopefully shouldn't need another big free agents show, since Derrick Henry was the big name coming into the start of the podcast that was remaining, and he signed while we were on air. So that made it nice and convenient that hopefully there's not a ton of breaking news right afterwards that negates things that we were saying on the show.
Yeah, I feel like this pretty much covers it. We'll see how things go in the coming weeks, but it was an exciting show. It was an exciting Monday and Tuesday here as all this news kind of broke, and obviously a bunch of defensive players as well got signed, and I'll be doing the same thing, talking IDP free agent landing spots later this week as well for the podcast. So if you're into that kind of thing, stay tuned for that as well. Check out the PFF.com, where we have the promo code again, 30MDS, for 30% off an annual PFF subscription. But again, thank you everybody for tuning in. Enjoy the rest of free agency and as we head into draft season here, and we will see you next time. So peace out.